Hello, everyone. Oh, I think what I'm gonna do is just take off the waiting room. Hi, everyone.
Hi.
Hi. Welcome, welcome. I know people kind of start filtering in slowly for like the first 10 minutes or so. Well, it is 5:30, so I will slowly get started. Okay. First of all, can everyone see the screen? Like purple?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. If you can't, let me know. Hi, I'm Megan. I'm the chief pilot at Girls Love to Fly, and I recognize some of your guys' names, maybe from previous Zooms or just maybe being on the flight schedule. So hi. Um, I've been a CFI, CF double I. I've been a CFI for 3 years now. Been a double I for almost 2 years. So I've been doing it for a little while. I've been with Girls with the Fly pretty much that entire time. I pretty much joined as soon as I got my CFI, so been here for a while, and very excited to teach you guys about systems. I do think systems aren't delved in. I don't think people dive into them quite enough for the private pilot. So hopefully this provides a little bit more insight on how the overall systems of the aircraft works. We'll kind of specifically be talking about the Cessna 150 just because that is our primary trainer aircraft at Girls Love to Fly. I'm also very familiar with 172s. So I might throw in some wisdom about like the 172 or the Piper Cherokee, since Girls Love to Fly has both the Piper and the Cessna. So, but I'll specify which one I'm talking about in terms of just so no one's confused. But yeah, so we'll be talking about aircraft systems today. So first thing I wanted to kind of get into, not necessarily systems, but part of maintenance is just understanding what the definition of airworthiness means. The definition is the status of an aircraft engine, propeller, or part when it conforms to its type certificate and any approved modifications like supplemental type certificates, which is STC, AD, which is airworthiness directives, and complying with those airworthiness directives, and the aircraft is in a safe condition for operation. So, kind of just to break down some of those terms, type certificate just means that it's kind of like the original birth certificate of the aircraft. And the type certificate, think of it of like this is the blueprint for the airplane, and each model has its own type certificate that kind of lays out the required equipment for this airplane, the weight and balance of the plane when it was first type certificated, and just the regulations that the plane falls under for maintenance. Um, any approved modifications, STCs, supplemental type certificates. Basically, it's the FAA giving you permission to make any major modifications to the airplane. An example would actually be like installing shoulder harnesses in the plane. Need an STC for that, just for the FAA to approve that installation. It's considered a major modification. And then AD compliance, AD is airworthiness directives. Kind of think of like a recall on your car. Every aircraft model has some component that has been identified to be an unsafe, to be kind of like an unsafe condition. So to comply with the airworthiness directive, it basically has a compliance time, which just means like, for example, for a 172, a lot of 172s have an airworthiness directive regarding checking the seat tracks because the seat tracks get worn very easily. And when you lift up the lever of the seat to move back and forth, you're basically taking like a little nub outside of a hole, shifting forward or backwards, and then that nub goes into that next hole to keep you in place. Those holes get a lot bigger over time just because we're jamming them back and forth so often. So they do get worn pretty quickly. So normally the airworthiness directive compliance time for the seat track back or for the seat tracks are, I think it's usually like every 100 hours or every annual, kind of depends on the model. But so that just means every 100-hour or every annual, whatever the compliance time is, the mechanics have to go in and check the condition of the seat tracks. And there's different airworthiness directives depending on the model. I just say, it's kind of like the same energy as a car recall. And then the meaning of airworthiness just means that the aircraft matches the FAA approved design, so the proper parts, equipment, and systems are installed, and then there's no mechanical defects, corrosion, damage, leaks, worn tires, broken instruments, etc. So we're basically just ensuring, even if it has all of the required maintenance done in the plane, and we are operating it to its approved design, such as like we're not performing aerodynamics, or I'm sorry, we're not performing aerobatics in the 150, that might all be well and fine, but If the tires are bald, that's not a condition for safe operation. If there's anything that's leaking, that's not a condition for safe operation. So even though the paperwork is perfect, the plane's not airworthy. So that's just breaking down airworthiness and things that you should be looking out for as pilots. Um, and also just being aware of it is the owner operator responsibility to maintain the aircraft in an airworthy condition, but it is the PIC's responsibility to ensure that it is in an airworthy condition before you fly. So it's both owner operator responsibility and PIC responsibility. The difference is the owner operator has to maintain it, has to pay for the maintenance and get the maintenance done, but the PIC has to verify. Questions so far? Might have been sort of kind of a lot, but we'll continue. Okay, cool. No one's in the waiting room. Okay, fabulous. All right, operations of systems. So we're kind of just going to walk through all four of these. So you have the flight controls, and we separate them via primary flight controls and secondary flight controls. So the primary flight controls, those are essential for just your basic flight maneuvers, turning, pitching up and down, yawing, swinging the nose back and forth. So those would be your ailerons, your elevators, and your rudder. Those are your primary flight controls, essential for basic maneuvers. And then you have your secondary flight controls, which pretty much just enhance the experience for the pilot. So an example would be flaps. Flaps are secondary, your trim is secondary. All it does is it enhances the performance of the plane and it also eases the pilot's workload. So secondary, other examples would be that we don't have in the 150, for example, would be like spoilers on a jet. So those are secondary controls on a jet. So just anything that kind of isn't required for basic flight maneuvers, but just makes your life easier would be a secondary control. Let's see, so that's flight controls, and they're operated by pulleys and cables. So you've maybe noticed, if any of you have been pre-flighting before, when you pre-flight the aileron, for example, and you, oh, sorry, we have a radio in here. That just went off. We have a handheld radio. Okay. Pulleys and cables. So if you've ever pre-flighted the aileron and you push the aileron up to look inside, you might notice when you look inside, like towards the wing, the inboard side of the wing, you see cables. So for example, those cables are in the ailerons, they're in the elevator, they're in the rudder. So it's just pulleys and cables inside the plane. Those pulleys and cables are lubricated and checked every 100-hour and every annual. So those are very important. Going down to the power plant is just a fancy word for the engine and the propeller, one cohesive unit, so we call it the power plant. Thinking about the power plant of the 150 or a 172 or even the Piper Cherokee, they're single engine piston aircraft. They're driven by pistons, just like your car, if you have like a not electric car. So we'll go into pistons a little bit later on, but pistons are located in the cylinders and they move up and down. So we also call piston piston engines reciprocating engines. It's the same thing. We're just using the piston versus the word reciprocating, but the piston reciprocates inside the cylinder. So single engine piston, single engine reciprocating. And then another thing about the engine is it's normally aspirated, which just means it is affected by the air temperature or the air pressure outside. So for example, if you have a turbo engine, the turbo engine creates its own internal pressure. And what that means is you could be operating at 14,000 feet with a turbo engine or like a turbo prop, and the airplane's engine is going to perform as if it were at sea level. Our plane will not do that. Our plane is affected by altitude, by pressure. So if you go, the higher you go, we get a decrease in performance. Just like your car does, if you're ever driving your car in like Lake Tahoe, if you're from California, or just driving your car anywhere that's like higher elevation, your car works harder too. You notice like you have to step on the gas pedal a lot more to get the same amount of speed, and then you hear your engine making a really unhappy sound. the plane does the same thing. A lot higher, but it's normally aspirated. And you can find like the more engine information in the aircraft's POH, pilot operating handbook. It'll tell you like the type of engine it is. It'll tell you the manufacturer. For example, the 150 is a Continental O200. That's the model of our engine. Continental is the manufacturer. Another popular manufacturer is Lycoming. Those are usually the two you'll see in like training aircraft, at least like a Cessna or a Piper training aircraft. And then going into fuel, oil, and hydraulics, most of that system information is going to be in the POH. We are going to talk more about the fuel system in, I think, the next slide. So I won't go too much into that. And then you have the electrical system. There are electrical components in the aircraft, namely the instruments, the lights, navigation, communications. Those are all usually electrical. The turn coordinator. Flaps are typically electrical. In the Piper Cherokee or like in older models of 172s, they're manual. You have a bar in the middle of the seats. It's called a Johnson bar. I actually prefer Johnson bars. I think they're cool. So you can have manual flaps, but typically in newer planes, they're electric. Another thing to consider when you're talking about the electrical system is if you're going to go on and into like your commercial training, just be aware that landing gear is also electrical. So when we talk about electrical failures, you always kind of want to have that at the back of your head when you're preparing for electrical failures, is remembering if you're in a complex retractable gear aircraft, remember to get the landing gear down if you ever suspect that you're having an electrical failure or an alternator failure. Okay, fuel components. So I took these images straight from the POH. I'll just kind of go through them and then I'll actually show you the POH page just to kind of put it all together. So whenever I talk about systems to students or on my own check rides, what tends to help me figure out how to talk about it is just breaking down each component and kind of working through like the process of or the flow of how the system works together. So I like to talk about the fuel tanks. The fuel tanks are located in the wings. In both the Piper and the Cherokee, we just have one fuel tank each wing. In the Cessna, or I'm sorry, in the Cessna and then the Piper. In the Cessna, the 150, we have 26 gallons total. 22 and a half of those are usable. And then in the Piper, we have 50 gallons total and then I think 47 usable. So whenever we're talking about fuel, you're going to have an element of unusable fuel. And unusable fuel is just what it sounds like. You can't use it. You can't plan to use it in your calculations. And the reason we have unusable fuel is just the way the plane is built. The plane will be in different attitudes. It'll be up and down. You'll be in a pitch or you'll be in a different angle of bank to the left and to the right. And think about like if you're ever drinking from a cup with a straw, you have to tilt the cup a certain way to get like the remaining liquid. Same thing with the plane. So just because of the way the tanks are built, a little bit of fuel gets stuck at the bottom and like in like the bends and the random pockets inside of the tank. So not all of it's going to be usable 100% of the time. So we just plan not to use it at all. So that's why there's unusable fuel included. Then you have the fuel selector, which just determines if you're opening or closing a valve inside the fuel lines. In the 150, we only have on or off. So you can either open the valve or close the valve. In the Piper Cherokee, we have left, right, and off. So you can either pull fuel from the left tank or from the right tank, but not at the same time, or you can turn it off. In 172s, usually you have left, right, and both. And in a 172, we typically operate on both. You could operate on one or the other if like there's a fuel imbalance in the wings, but typically a 172, you just operate on both. And if you're operating like just on the left side, you're closing the valve on the right side and then vice versa. So 150 again, just on or off. And usually the fuel selector in a Cessna is located in the middle of the seats somewhere. Might be a little bit forward of you, might be like right in between the seats. And then the Piper is on the pilot side near your legs. Then you have the fuel strainer, which just gets rid of any extra debris that you might have missed on your fuel sumping during your pre-flight. So it's just like a screen that catches any extra debris from right before it goes into the engine. Because the engine does not like random pieces of dirt and water inside of it. It will not operate the same. You also have the mixture control, which is the red knob. So again, all of these, like the knobs and the levers that you're pushing and pulling, all they're doing is they're opening and closing different valves. So the mixture is opening and closing a valve as well. It's opening and closing a valve for the mixture to go into the intake manifold right before it enters the cylinders. And you need both fuel and air to produce engine power, just like you need fuel and air to start a fire. And you also have the primer in both the 150 and in the Cherokee and in older models of 172s. What the primer is doing is you're injecting fuel directly into the cylinders just to get the engine started. And that's all you would use it for. You don't use it really any other time in flight. It's just to get the plane started, because when the plane is sitting for a while and there's you haven't flown it, there's no fuel in the engine, so there's nothing for the engine to combust. So you're helping it out. And then once it starts, then fuel starts flowing to the engine naturally, and you don't need the primer anymore. And then the last one, you have the fuel sumps. So kind of mentioned that earlier. The fuel sumps, you do that during your pre-flight. You're walking around with that little cup that has like a needle, and you have different fuel sumps on either wing. In the 150, you have one on either wing, and then one on the belly. In the Piper, I believe it's the same. You have one on either wing, one under the belly. Newer models of 172s, like 172S models, they have 13 sumps. They have 5 on each wing and 3 on the belly. So you're getting very quality sumping in a 172 with 13 sumps. Ultimately, you're just checking the quality of the fuel, making sure that it's the right kind of gas, avgas, 100 low lead, which is pretty much the one that we all operate on with a piston aircraft, is, I just admitted somebody, making sure I don't miss anyone. Fuel sumps. So you're checking the quality of the fuel. Oh, you're making sure that you have the correct gas. So avgas, 100 low lead's a light blue color. So make sure that you have a light blue color inside the fuel tanks. And if there's any water in there, the water will sink to the bottom and it'll be super obvious. It literally looks like a bunch of little bubbles. So if you have water in your fuel sump sample, keep sumping until there's no water. I mean, if you get to like 10 sumps though, and there's still water in there, I wouldn't fly, and I would, if we're out of McClellan, I would let the jet center know and be like, I think your fuel might be contaminated. You guys might want to check. Or maybe if it rained overnight, that could also be an issue. Maybe rain got into the fuel tank somehow in the 150 or in the Piper. So just keeping that in mind. Questions? I'm going to show you guys the POH, just so you can kind of see how that all came together.
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
The primer, I've never, is that also called the fuel pump?
It might be, yeah. If you're like in a fuel injected 172, we just call it the fuel pump. So
Okay.
yes, that could totally be the fuel pump. It's confusing because like in Piper Cherokees, for example, you have a primer and a fuel pump. And the reason for that is because Pipers are low wings, and in the high wing, like a Cessna, the fuel is gravity fed to the engine. So it just flows from gravity, which makes sense because it's above the engine. But in the Piper, it's a low wing, so it needs an engine-driven fuel pump in order to pull the fuel into the engine. And so you have an engine-driven fuel pump, just operates when the engine is running. And then you have the aux pump, or the fuel pump, that you can use in the case of an emergency. In terms of like, if you had an engine failure, maybe the engine-driven fuel pump failed, so you would turn on the auxiliary or the fuel pump, both the same thing, because it could help the engine run in lieu of the engine-driven fuel pump. But then it has a primer, so it's confusing language, but in like newer 172s, it's just a fuel pump, and you only use it for priming. So it's like, it is your primer, but we don't call it that. So we love to confuse people with our wording in aviation, and as you guys get more and more involved, you will find that out, and there's a lot of people mad about it. So, but good question. I'm glad you brought that up. Okay, let me make sure. Let's go back. Hearing. Okay. Here we go. So this is just so you guys can see it. This is the fuel schematic all put together in the POH for the 150. Not a whole lot of details. It's an old POH, so they're a little bit less thorough in terms of the information they provide, but it does give you a visual. So it's really good if you're like a visual learner. This might help you figure out like, hey, if I'm a drop of fuel, here's my journey. I'm going to go from the left and from the right tank through this fuel line, through the fuel selector. If it's on, that means the valve is open. So I will continue through the fuel strainer, get all cleaned, and then through to the carburetor. And in the carburetor, I'm getting mixed up with the air that's available, which the throttle controls. So I'm now fuel that's getting mixed with air in the carburetor, and then I'm injected into the engine cylinders. So that is your journey. That's a drop of fuel in a 150. Other component that I did not mention is the fuel vent. Usually the fuel vent's located on the pilot side wing. And all that does is it helps equalize pressure inside the fuel tanks, because if you think about it, when you drive to a higher elevation location and you have a bag of chips, a bag of chips gets really puffy because you drove from an area of higher pressure to an area of lower pressure. Same thing happens in a plane. You're flying up to higher altitudes where the pressure is low, but the tanks are carrying the pressure from the ground. So if we didn't have a fuel vent to help equalize the pressure to the outside pressure, you would have the bag of chips but in your fuel tank. And as you can imagine, the higher you go and the puffier it gets, at some point, it cannot withstand that. So we have to have the fuel vent. So make sure that's not blocked during your pre-flight. Back to the presentation.
Can I actually ask a question about that, the fuel
Yeah,
vent?
sure.
So I was asked a couple of times like why is there only one? Because so often in the plane there's like redundancies.
Mm-hmm.
And I like as far as I can find, it's because you only need one
Yeah, in a
fuel
way, you
vent.
only need one because there is that cross flow. Like the tanks, that the vent cross flows into the other wing. Even if you're only operating like on the left side, let's say, it doesn't close like the fuel vent. So the fuel vent goes all the way across and it vents out the other wings. It doesn't, I want, don't quote me, I'd have to look this up to confirm, but I do believe some fuel caps on the right side, on the passenger side wing, they have a little hole to act as a fuel vent on the fuel cap. I'd have to confirm that though. I'm pretty sure I've heard that, but I don't want to say that because I'm not 100% sure. But so that would be like your other fuel vent on the other side. But I will look
Okay.
into that.
Because I think, yeah, I think on the 172, the fuel cap has like an orange
Yeah,
button on the inside, which does that indicate the fuel of like
that
a vent?
might. It has an orange what?
It's like under the cap, it's like a little orange button. It's like a little circle.
Okay.
Even though if you look at it on the top, it looks like a screw, but I think that the
That
cap is
might be it.
ventilated.
I've seen ones where like kind of, when you're grabbing the fuel cap, there's like the little part that sticks up and it doesn't help you grip it.
Yeah.
I've seen it to where there's like a little hole kind of underneath the grip, and that was told to me that that's the fuel vent for that cap. So I don't think I've seen it where it's like an orange button, but I don't know. So I don't want to say anything about it.
Okay. And
But from what I understand, there are fuel caps that provide that ventilation. Okay. Nope, nope, lost control. Here we go. Electrical components. Okay, so again, talking about the electrical system, but I'm going to break it down into components first, just because it helps me personally in my brain organize all of my thoughts. So first off, you have a bus bar, and you'll hear people talking about the main bus, the battery bus, the essential bus, the avionics bus. In the 150, we only have one bus, so it's very simple. When you get into like 172s, especially the S models, they have, I think, if you have a G1000 model, it's like 6 buses. In a non G1000 model, I believe it's 5. So the more electrical components you have and the more updated avionics that you have, you're going to have more buses. Because what the bus does is it's basically like, think of like a power strip where you plug a bunch of cords into. That's your bus bar. We're plugging into this bar that's usually made of like copper or aluminum. You're plugging all of these components into the bar, and like a power strip, the bus bar distributes to multiple circuits and components of the plane. So it just takes the power and distributes it appropriately, because every little item is only needs a certain amount of amps in order to function. So the bus bar helps distribute that, just think of a power strip um, at your house, that you plug a bunch of things into, a bunch of phone chargers, same thing. And then next you have fuses or circuit breakers. Some planes kind of have a combination of both. They both function ultimately the same way. Fuses and circuit breakers are meant to protect the electrical components of your aircraft. They operate just a little differently, but their purpose is the same. They protect electrical components from overvoltage and ultimately protect you from dealing with an electrical fire. So the fuse is a one-time protective device. There's a little wire, a metal wire inside of it. It's like a little clear tube with a metal wire in it. If there's an overvoltage in that specific component, let's say the fuse is connected to one of the lights, if there's an overvoltage, that wire will melt, and when the current exceeds the safe limit, and that basically disconnects that component. So no electricity is going to that component anymore because it's dangerous and it might cause a fire. So it's just off because that fuse wire has melted. You can replace fuses. If you have a plane with fuses, you'll eventually talk about, or you may already know, under 91205 for VFR nighttime, you're required to have a spare set of fuses or 3 of a kind, something like that. And I'm not saying it verbatim, but you do have to have a spare set of fuses. Just in case you want to replace one of them. Most modern planes now have circuit breakers, which are more contemporary, and what they do, same thing, they protect from an overvoltage. You'll notice if you fly an aircraft with circuit breakers, they kind of look like little buttons, and they have a number on all of them, and that is the amount of amperes that the component is rated for. So like a light might be 5 amps. Your radios are usually like 15 amps. They usually use a little bit more. Flaps might be 10 amps. Little things could be 5 amps. There's even some that are 1 amp. So they're only rated to take 1 amp in terms of like electrical current. And if it exceeds that amount, then the breaker will just pop out, and it disconnects that component from everything else, essentially turning it off, disconnecting it. And the thing about circuit breakers is you're allowed to reset them one time. So they're called push to reset. You typically want to wait like 3 to 5 minutes before you try to reset it, because you want to give it time to cool down. You can push to reset it once. If it stays in, okay, great. It might have been a fluke. If it pops out again, leave it alone, leave it out. There's obviously something going wrong with that piece of equipment, and that's something that you're going to have to talk to the mechanic about. If it's something that's required, then you're going to have to ground the plane until that gets fixed. Yeah, so you can push to reset circuit breakers. Fuses, a little bit more complicated. You have to fully replace them, but they're both meant for the same thing. And then you have the alternator. So the alternator charges the battery. It's engine driven, and it's engine driven when you do your pre-flight. I guess it's more so for a 172 or the Piper. You'll notice right behind the the nose, like the propeller, and then the nose cone. Right behind that, there's a black belt. That's the alternator belt. That black belt is connected to the crankshaft, which when the engine runs and the crankshaft spins, connected to the belt, that belt starts turning and then therefore uh, converts mechanical energy into electrical energy. So the alternator is now on, alternator charges the battery, provides electricity throughout the entire system of the aircraft. The alternator is made of two components. You have a stator and a rotor. You have the rotor is like a rotating electromagnet attached to a shaft, and then the stator, the rotor's inside the stator, and the rotor spins. Rotor rotation, it spins, and then you have the stator. Think of like stator, stationary, doesn't move. It's kind of just like the shell of the rotor, and basically when it spins, it like excites. It generates what we call it an excitation. So it generates electricity for the start. And when you turn on the master switch when you're pre-flighting, you're operating strictly on the battery. So it's pertinent that when you're pre-flighting and you might be turning on the battery just to check the lights, and if your flaps are electric, you want to put the flaps down and such. Don't spend too much time with the master on because you're draining straight from the battery. Once the engine's on, the alternator's on. But if the engine's not on, you're on the battery, and the battery only has so long to operate electrically. And you need the battery to start the plane because when you're first starting the plane, you're drawing electrical energy from the battery because the alternator's not running yet, because the engine's not running yet. So sometimes over time, if people take too long to pre-flight, or sometimes I've seen it happen, people will go through their entire pre-flight with the master on because they forgot to turn it off. That happens enough times, the battery might eventually just die, and then you won't be able to start the plane. You have to start the battery, or you have to charge the battery overnight and get that all sorted. So make sure you turn the master off in time when you're free flighting because you're using it to start the plane. Then you have the master switch. Kind of was just talking about that. When you turn on the master switch, it turns on the battery. So anything else with that? In the 150, the master switch is just one switch. In newer 172s, you have a master switch that has two separate switches in it. So you have the alternator switch and the battery switch. They're separate, which is kind of nice. But older aircraft is just one red switch. It's usually red. Then you have your navigation and comms. So navigation, communication, those are both electrical. And your communication takes, like the radios, they take up the most electrical energy. So in the event of an alternator failure, if you have an alternator failure, not really an emergency if you're VFR, because you still have the battery. The battery will run for about 30 minutes or so. So you still have 30 minutes of electrical energy. That being said, like I said earlier, if you're planning on moving forward in your aviation and flying, and you know you're going to start flying like complex aircraft, first thing you want to do is get the gear down because while an alternator failure is not an emergency tech really for VFR, it could absolutely become an emergency if you forget to put the gear down, you lose all electricity, and now you can't get the gear down. There are manual ways to extend it for emergency situations, but some airplanes, for some reason, they put the emergency extension gear like in the back where you can barely reach it. So it's hard, single pilot, to be flying, maintaining altitude, not hitting anybody or anything. And then you're reaching back and you're trying to crank this lever. So it might not be a big deal because most airplanes, they have the gear extension like right in front of the pilot or right beneath the pilot, which is where it should be. Some planes do not though. So I just say get the gear down as soon as you can. And keep your radio calls to a minimum because your radio calls take up a lot of electrical energy. Just like I was kind of talking about earlier, on the circuit breakers, your radios normally take up the most amount of amps. So lots of energy goes into making your transmission. So keep them to a minimum. And if you eventually lose your battery, your engine is still running because your engine generates its own electricity via the magnetos. Magnetos are just like spinning magnets wrapped in like coils of wire. And you have two of them for redundancy in the engine, and that's completely separate from the electrical system. And we do that on purpose. I mean, I don't. I'm not a mechanic, but manufacturers do that on purpose. You have that redundant system. Electricity fails, engine's not going to fail. You still have the engine. Lights and flaps are also electric flaps. Sometimes they're not. Just depends on the plane. But and again, in terms of an electrical failure, you might have to make a no flap landing if your flaps are electric and you don't have time to get them down before you lose the battery. So you might be doing a no flap landing, maybe plan to go to a longer runway or to a towered airport so that you can get the plane serviced in the event of an alternator failure. And also, if you go to a towered airport, you can utilize light gun signals for them to help you get down. You could totally go to a non-towered airport too. Just know that people might not be looking out for you if you're not talking because you can't talk. So it might be a little bit more complicated of an entry if it's a busy airport. So usually towered airports could be a good bet. Stay out of any Bravos. They don't want you in there if you can't talk to anybody, if they can't see you. So stay out of the Bravos if any are nearby. I know go off on tangents a lot. So if you have any questions, please let me know.
I have a quick question. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I feel like
No,
I'm
no worries.
like the annoying student.
No, 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 you're fine.
So the master switch,
Mhm.
I now that you're saying it, I can't remember. I think so in the Cessna 172, the master switch I think is split.
Probably.
Um, but like you were saying, if you only like do your pre-flight with like running off battery power,
Mhm.
I was taught to flip both at like during the pre-flight. Like you put it on and like you wouldn't like choose.
Yeah, you could flip both. It really won't make a difference because the alternator is not on anyway. So it's totally
Oh.
fine to flip both. What's nice about it is like if you had an alternator failure, you can reset the alternator without turning off the battery. So like you could just turn off the alternator part and then turn the battery still on and then turn on the alternator back on to reset it. Because sometimes if the alternator like fails, all it does is all you need to do is turn it off and then on again. Sometimes that works, just like a computer.
Oh.
So it's kind of nice to have that separation so that you can do it that way. Does that make sense?
It does, yeah. I'm like kind of wondering about all these like little questions that like
Yeah. There's so many things to ask about, especially with electronics. So don't hold
yeah,
it
it's definitely like I was really excited to see your session tonight because it's like I can like memorize whatever, but there's a lot
back.
that's not intuitive. So like if someone
Yeah.
were to ask me like, well, if like, well, why are you flipping on like both sides of the master switch? I'd be
Yeah.
like someone told me to do it,
Someone
which
told
is
me to do it
not a
that way.
great answer.
Sure.
So
Yeah,
it's like
it doesn't
little
really
things.
matter just because the alternator's not on. So, like, I've done it to where the 172 I fly has them split, and I've just pre-flighted by just turning on the battery. Now, maybe there's some like insight that a mechanic would have as to why, like, maybe turning on both is better, or but it's funny. I was told like you can just turn on the battery because the alternator is not going to turn on anyway. I don't think it's hurting anything just because well the alternator is engine driven. So even if you turn the switch on, it's not going to turn on. So I don't see the harm in that.
Okay.
Yeah,
Thanks.
of
Thank
course.
you.
Here's an example of an electrical schematic for this is the 150. As I said, only one bus bar. It's very simple. You get into 172s, especially 172S models, or a whole bunch of bus bars because it's the planes. All the instruments are electric. In the 150, that's not the case. Only the turn coordinator is electric in terms of your six pack. So everything else, and then you just have all the components like the alternator. Here's your magnetos. And so it kind of goes in order in terms of like where energy is flowing is when you turn the key. So when you turn the key in the plane, so we're going to go down here to the ignition switch. Once you turn the key, what you're doing is you're contacting the starter contactor, which distributes the energy into the starter. And the way that they show this is kind of funky, but the starter is kind of like a gear. So just like, a disc with teeth. And what happens is when you turn the key to start, because you have left, right, both, and start. When you twist it to start, you're taking energy from the battery, electrical energy from the battery, to engage the starter gear. And when I say engage, I mean the starter gear is moving forward. Starter gear moves forward, and it's trying to catch the flywheel, which is just behind the propeller. And the flywheel is connected to the crankshaft, which is connected to the cylinders, which have the pistons. So it's all one system that's just rotating. So the starter gear catches the flywheel. Flywheel is also like a gear. They start turning into each other. Starter turns, which turns the flywheel. And when you have enough fuel air mixture, by turning the flywheel, you're turning a crankshaft, which is like a funky looking arm. The funky looking arm, I have a board I can draw. Erase this person's lovely diagram. I'm sorry. The flywheel, hopefully I'll make sure you guys can see this, or the crankshaft is kind of shaped like this. And then you have like pistons connected to either side. And then you have the flywheel here. And then you have the nose, and then you have the propeller. And then we'll say that the starter gear is down here. This might not be to scale, so keep that in mind. Starter gear is down here. That moves forward and starts turning the flywheel, which then starts turning the crankshaft, which then starts reciprocating the pistons up and down. And when the pistons have fuel and air inside the cylinders, you get combustion. So we are converting electrical energy into mechanical energy. It all starts with engaging the starter, which draws electricity from the battery, moves the starter forward, starts spinning the flywheel, starts spinning the crankshaft, pistons start moving up and down. You're getting chemical energy, converting and starting the engine that way. That's why when you start the plane, if you hold on to the starter too long, you hear a really nasty grinding noise. You're grinding the starter. So it's super easy to accidentally burn out the starter when you're starting a plane if you hold on to the start too long. And it's trial and error. Don't feel bad if you've done it. I've done it. So it's just something that you eventually figure out the timing for. You gain the ear for when the propeller catches, is what I say. When it catches, it kind of makes like when if you're starting a lawnmower, if you ever started a lawnmower or heard a lawnmower start, there's a pause and like a certain noise that it makes that it's going to start, and you can let go of you can stop pulling on the string. Same thing with the like a 150 or a Piper or a 172. That's why we call them flying lawnmowers, because it's very similar in terms of the noise that they make. So 90%, this is what I've been told by a mechanic, 90% of the wear and tear on an engine comes from starting it, because everything's cold. Things are being grinded against each other without being lubricated first. So there's a lot of wear and tear that goes into starting a plane. So we try to mitigate that by learning proper starting techniques. Usually reading the POH will do it. It will give you everything you need to know on how to start the engine under certain conditions. So yeah, then you got the bus bar. Here's the different fuses, because the 150 has fuses. So you have fuses for the flaps, fuses for the wing lights, beacon, for the nav lights, and the dome light. The dome light's just like a light inside of the cockpit. Radios. We only have 2 radios. I think there's an option to add a third one, but we have 2 radios, 2 comms. Then you have fuel indicators down here. So those are just all the different components connected to that bus bar. If you're in a 172 that has multiple bus bars, then you'll have different components connected to each bus bar, and it'll be organized. Oh, can you guys see this? Probably not. I don't know if that helps, but the 2 spiky circles that I drew, the one on top is the flywheel, and the one on the bottom is the starter. It's supposed to be, at least. And then the like the half squares, that's the crankshaft. It's kind of shaped like that. And then you have the cylinders connected to them. Hopefully that helps. You know what? What I'll probably do is get everyone's email, and then I can take a picture of this and send it to you, or even better, I can find a better illustration of it and send it to you guys, and then I can also send this presentation to you.
I think, I mean, I can see it. I think it
Okay.
looks good. I
Okay.
don't know about anyone else, but
Hopefully.
it was fine.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
I'll take a picture of it and I'll send it to everyone too. I can get your guys' email and whatnot at the end, just so we're all on the same page. I know it's a lot of information, and you're not going to remember every single thing that I've talked about today, and that's totally fine. That's why I'll probably just send you guys this presentation too. Okay, operation of systems. I have this little code up here. This is just from the private pilot ACS. And this is like the task that this falls under. So just so you know, this is like one of the elements of the airman certification standards that we are talking about today. And the airman certification standards, the ACS, that is what you're going to be tested on during your check ride. So we're covering that stuff right now. So different systems you have in the plane. One, you have avionics. I've kind of been throwing that term around. All it means is aviation electronics. So your navigation system, your transponder, your communications, that's all part of your avionics. If you have GPS will be part of your avionics. A common set of avionics you would see is like a G1000. That's like a kind of avionics. So just nav comm systems, aviation electronics. That's what we're talking about. And the more technically advanced you have, the more electrical components you have, and the more buses you're gonna have. One thing I have my notes over here if you see me glancing over here. So one thing I kind of wanted to go over is technically advanced airplanes. Um, for your commercial certificate, if you guys decide to go that route, you need 10 hours of complex and or TAA time, technically advanced aircraft. So complex just means like retractable gear, constant speed propeller. So basically just an airplane with more systems for you to know, more systems for you to be familiar with, and more systems to challenge you to be a better pilot. TAA, similar concept, except we're strictly talking avionics. So if you're in a TAA aircraft, you have a primary flight display, a multifunctional display, and you have at least a two-axis autopilot. So when I say two-axis, I mean it can hold your heading and it can hold your altitude, at least. So it can at least hold two of the three axes for the plane. So you need all three of those components, and the primary flight display and the multifunctional display have to be visible at all times. So a G1000 aircraft is technically advanced. Even if it's a 172 with the G1000, it's still considered TAA as long as it has that plus the autopilot. Yeah, so that's what I just wanted to get into. You could do for the 10 hours for your commercial, you could do 5 hours TAA, 5 hours complex, any combination of the two. You could only do TAA or you could only do complex. It used to just be complex, but they changed this rule like, I don't know, maybe 6 years ago, maybe a little bit longer than that. It's fairly recent that they added the combination of, or you could do TAA advanced or TAA aircraft because if the idea is if you're a commercial pilot, you're going to be flying nicer planes with updated avionics. So they want to make sure you have the experience prior. So that's why it counts. I recommend getting a little bit of complex time though, because it really does help in terms of making you a better pilot. Pitot-static. So pitot-static system is all of your instruments with a needle. So your airspeed indicator, your altimeter, and your vertical speed indicator. Those are all needles. So just think of pitot-static as all the needles. When I say pitot-static, we're talking about the pitot tube, which is in this picture right here. That goes to your airspeed indicator only. And then your static ports go to all three. So static. So pitot, static. Airspeed indicator, altimeter, vertical speed indicator. And really how they work, all of them, is they're just measuring a difference in pressure. So for example, the pitot tube, you get air going into this hole right here. It's called the ram air inlet. So you're getting ram air, and there's a little hole at the back here of the pitot tube. It's called the drain hole. So if there's any ice or water, it'll drain it. But also, it gathers static air pressure just from air pressure outside. And the combination of ram air and static air in the pitot tube is called dynamic air. And then you have the static ports, which are just like those little raised circles on the pilot side of the cowling that have like a little hole in them. They're just measuring air pressure from outside and filtering it into the instrument casing. So I do have pictures of the instrument casing on the next slide just to show you. So let's see. I want to talk about the airspeed indicator. So here's that ram air going into the pitot tube. And then here's the static port. So the static air is going in here, and the ram air and the dynamic air pressure is going into the pitot tube. And here is what's called a diaphragm. Think of an accordion. It expands and contracts. So what we're doing with this diaphragm here is you have static air that's going into the casing overall, just in this general area. And then you have the pitot tube, that air goes into the diaphragm. As you are on the takeoff roll and you start speeding up, you're forcing air into the ram air inlet in the pitot tube. That air forces this diaphragm to expand in comparison to the static air pressure in the case. So as it expands, then it controls this little gear that moves the needle and gives you an airspeed indication. So all we're doing is measuring the ram air pressure versus the static pressure to get a movement on a needle. And when you're on your takeoff roll, your airspeed indicator is required for VFR. So when you're on your takeoff roll, one of your callouts should be airspeed alive. You're making sure that you are indeed getting an airspeed reading and that there's nothing blocking the pitot tube. Because if there's something that's blocking the pitot tube, like a bug crawled in there, which happens more often than you think, the airspeed is going to be frozen at 0. And as you're going down the runway, you're looking for like a rotation speed, and then you're looking at the needle and there's no reading. So you abort the takeoff because something's wrong. More than likely, it's something's blocking the pitot tube. That's why it's part of your pre-flight check. That's why we try to cover the pitot tubes with pitot tube covers because we don't want anything getting in there. But things happen. Sometimes, like on takeoff, you might like smash into a bug at just the right angle to where it covers the pitot tube on takeoff, and then your airspeed's frozen. So that's how the airspeed indicator works. It's really just measuring pressure differences between the diaphragm and the overall casing. And then I will talk about the vertical speed indicator as well. Works a little bit differently. This is the only one that has what's called a calibrated leak. So the calibrated leak, what that does is I'm going to reference my notes a little bit because I just want to make sure I say it correctly. The calibrated leak right here is a tiny hole. It connects the casing of the VSI to the static source and the static ports. The hole in the calibrated leak is small enough to restrict airflow. So the air going into the casing cannot it can't flow as quickly. And so it doesn't move as quickly as like the diaphragm would, because the diaphragm just has direct static pressure. And then you have this calibrated leak. So air is going into the diaphragm and into the casing through the calibrated leak, but the calibrated leak is a lot slower than the air going into the diaphragm. So the VSI relies on air leaking out of or into the casing, and then it takes a few seconds for it to stabilize. So this is where you get trend of your vertical speed versus rate. Because when you're climbing or descending, you'll notice that the needle of the VSI will immediately climb or immediately descend, but it takes a few seconds for it to settle, like on a number, whether you're going 500 feet per minute in a climb or 500 feet per minute in a descent. It takes a few seconds for it to actually settle. That's because of the calibrated leak. We have a slow calibrated leak because we want it to accurately indicate like how fast we're climbing or how fast we're descending. So that's the trend, or that's the rate. The trend is just, is it up or down? Let's see. For a second or two. Yeah, after a second or two, the calibrated leak has a chance to catch up and reach equilibrium with like the diaphragm, and then the VSI will stabilize at a certain climb or descent rate. So when that happens, you have the rate information. You initially have trend, and then you have rate. I know that's so confusing. So don't feel bad if you're confused, because I was very confused reading about that. I was crying over calibrated leak, and I was like, that doesn't make any sense. And so I get it. Trust me. This is why I want. This is why I like teaching systems, because systems is really hard for me to learn. It just does not come naturally to me. So it's good to step outside your comfort zone and to learn things that are uncomfortable, and to learn things that make your weaker points your stronger points if you can. Let's see. Pedostatic vacuum system. So pedostatic is all your needles. Vacuum system is like your little airplanes. So vacuum system goes to your attitude indicator and your heading indicator. And typically on the attitude indicator and the heading indicator, you have like a little airplane displayed. So vacuum systems, all the small airplanes. And then you have your turn coordinator, which is also an airplane, but that is electric. So ignore that one. Your vacuum system is basically what we're talking about is suction. There you have an instrument case, just like what we were kind of looking at. You have an instrument casing, and then you have a gyro, and all a gyro is a spinning disc. If it's a disc that's not spinning, it's not a gyro. So when you have the suction going through the casing, you have the low pressure air flowing through the casing, being sucked at a certain pressure. We measure vacuum suction in inches of mercury. So on the vacuum indicator or the vacuum gauge, like in a 172 or a 150 or in the Piper, it'll be like, usually it's between 4 and 5. That's inches of mercury. That's usually where you want it to be. If you have under 4, it's pretty low suction. These instruments might not be accurate in terms of that, because the gyro is not spinning at the rate that it should be for operation. If you have too much suction, that could also be a problem. So with the vacuum suction in the system, and the vacuum system operates when the engine is running. So it's engine driven vacuum system. Engine runs, vacuum system begins to suck air out of the casing, which in then turn spins the gyro. And the gyro is mounted on this little gimbal. If you've ever seen people who are like filming anything, like filming like a movie, they have their phone or they have their camera on this like arm, and they can move the arm, but the like the phone or the camera doesn't move. That's a gimbal. So all the gimbal is it's like a mount that allows like the object that is mounted to it to not move. Even if you're moving the gimbal up and down, the object still stays there. So same thing with the gyro. The gyro is spinning, and everything's moving around that gyro, and then in turn you're getting like an indication of pitch or of bank. And that whole concept is called rigidity in space. The gyro is spinning, but it's not like moving. The airplane's moving around it, if you think about it that way. The gyro stays in the same spot in space, rigidity in space, and the plane moves around it. And the attitude indicator is a very similar construction. It's just the instrument that looks different. So all of these are mechanical. When you get into like TAA planes, then a lot of these are going to be electric. If not all of them will be electric. And the difference between like an electric pedostatic system or an electric attitude heading system is, instead of measuring differences in pressure, with diaphragms, they do it with sensors. And the way I think about it is, mechanically, they measure everything with like a legacy 6-pack aircraft, but with a technically advanced aircraft, they use sensors to calculate that same information. So the updated avionics will be more accurate. It'll provide you more information than like your typical legacy 6-pack. just something to think about. Maybe some of you are flying updated avionics, so just to kind of explain the difference between the two. De-icing and anti-icing. Most planes you're going to be flying for like private pilot don't have any de-icing equipment. De-icing would be like they have de-icing fluid that you can get that can spray onto the windshield. They have de-icing fluid that you could spray onto the propeller, with a flip of a switch. You also have something called boots. So if you approach like a complex airplane and you notice there's like a black strip on the leading edge of the wings, or even on the leading edge of the propeller, those are usually boots. And what they do is if you have icing and you turn on the boots, they expand and they like pop off the ice. So that's de-icing. That's de-icing is when you have ice and you're getting rid of it. You've already got the ice, you have the ability to get rid of it. Anti-icing is we're trying to prevent the ice from accumulating in the first place. And that's more so what like a 150 would have, or a 172 is anti-ice. So one version of that would be the pitot heat. So this pitot tube has a switch where you can turn it on, and there's a wire inside of this component. There's a wire inside that heats up, and it heats up the metal of the pitot tube, and it'll prevent any ice from accumulating because it's too hot. Another example would be like carburetor heat in a 150 or in a 172 that's carbureted. If you have a fuel injected engine, you don't have a carburetor, so you don't have carb heat because you can't have carb icing. So there's that advantage. But if you're in a carbureted plane, like the 150 or in the Piper Cherokee, we do have carb heat, and that just introduces hot air into the carburetor to prevent any ice from building up, and it will melt, trace amounts of ice. If you catch it early enough, it will melt it. But that's the key is to turn on the carb heat before you enter any sort of like icing condition. Same thing with the pitot heat. You're turning them on before you enter those conditions. You're not typically entering icing conditions with private pilots, but you're allowed to fly in rain as long as you have VFR minimums. So if you're flying in rain or in mist, and maybe the air is unstable and the lapse rate is larger than normal, and suddenly the freezing level is where you're at, and you're in visible moisture, such as mist or rain, you could start accumulating ice. So anytime I fly at night when it's cold, like nighttime in the wintertime and I'm up high in a carbureted engine, or if I'm flying in rain or mist with a carbureted engine, I turn on the pitot heat. And if it's carbureted, I turn on the carb heat too. And I fly with that until I exit those conditions. Cabin heat and air. If you're lucky enough, you have cabin heat and air. It's not the same thing as air conditioning or a heater. We're pretty much using recycled air. Cabin air, all you have is the air vents. It's just pulling air directly from outside. And then the cabin heat, similar. It's taking filtered air from outside. It passes it over the hot parts of the engine. So you have filtered air going inside the cowling, and it passes over one of the manifolds inside the engine, and the manifold's kind of just like a metal shroud and it gets really hot because it's the engine's running. So the air passes over that hot spot, and then it goes into the cabin and it's warm. So sometimes when you turn the cabin heat on for the first time in a while, you might smell like a weird smell. It's because you're smelling the engine. You're not smelling the exhaust per se, but you are smelling parts of the engine. The danger with cabin heat, though, is if you do have an exhaust leak or like a cracked exhaust pipe. Am I saying that right? Exhaust? I always exhaust. I think I'm saying that right. If I'm not, tell me. If you have a crack in an exhaust pipe or anywhere in your system, you could have those fumes leaking into the cabin when you turn on the cabin heat, and that could lead to carbon monoxide poisoning. So if you start feeling dizzy or lightheaded and you have the cabin heat on, or if your passengers are feeling dizzy and lightheaded, maybe nauseous, and the cabin heat is on, turn it off, open the windows if you're slow enough, and then open all of the air vents, because that's an indication of carbon monoxide poisoning, which is deadly. And you can't smell it, and you can't see it. It's colorless and odorless, so it's very dangerous. You could also You'd also get a carbon monoxide detector, which a lot of I think all of the newer four-flight Sentries have carbon monoxide detectors built in. So if you're using four-flight and it's hooked up to a Sentry, they are carbon monoxide detectors. So those are great. You could also buy like little ones that you could literally stick on to the panel, and there's like a little patch of something, some sort of chemical, and it turns black when there's carbon monoxide present. So you could put those safety measures in your plane, or ask your flight school to do it. That's kind of important. Sort of, kind of, it's just life or death. Malfunctions and failures. So different types of engine failures, different reasons, is you have fuel exhaustion, fuel starvation. There's a difference. So I think of the difference as fuel starvation. Somebody's presenting me a meal. There's a meal that is there that I can't have. Fuel starvation. There's fuel in the plane somewhere, but for whatever reason, it's not making it to the engine. This could be for several reasons. It could be, this has happened, not to me or not to anyone I know, but I have heard it secondhand, is that there was a student that was primarily trained in high wing airplanes like Cessnas, and they started flying in a Piper. And throughout their training, as they transitioned to the Piper, they were in their cross country phase. No one thought to tell them, hey, now that you're in a low wing, you have to remember to switch tanks, because in the 172, we typically just operate on both. We don't even think about it. We're always getting fuel. We operate on both. We don't look at it again until we land. In the Piper, you have to switch tanks. You operate on one tank for 45 minutes to an hour. Then you got to switch tanks to the other one because you can only pull from one. No one told the student that. So they were on a cross country and had an engine failure. Didn't know why. Thankfully, they were able to make an off airport landing. They landed in a field and they survived. It was fine. Plane, I think, got totaled somehow, but student was fine. That's what matters. Um, they ran one tank completely dry, but there was still fuel in the other tank. They just didn't know because they didn't know that they had switched tanks because no one told them. So that's fuel starvation. You still have fuel somewhere in the plane, but it's not making it to the engine. In this case, you ran one tank dry, you didn't switch to the other tank. Another reason for fuel starvation could be blockage in the fuel line from debris that didn't get filtered out, or like an engine-driven fuel pump failure. There's still fuel, but the fuel pump's not working. So starvation, there is fuel, but the engine's not getting it. Fuel exhaustion is you've exhausted all of your fuel. You've ran out of fuel, essentially. And that usually just comes from poor pre-flight planning. Um, Maybe a more unlikely, but it does happen, would be like if you lost the fuel cap somehow when you were flying and it flew off, and the low pressure on top of the wing acts like a vacuum, so it sucks out all of the fuel in your tank and you run out of fuel that way. Or you could have a fuel leak. I've heard a story where somebody on takeoff, they hit a deer, I think, unfortunately, on takeoff, and or actually I think it was a buck, because I think they hit the buck and the antler like punctured a hole in the fuel tank, and so they're leaking fuel. So that's another way like you can get fuel exhaustion. But most likely it's probably like poor pre-flight planning. You ran out of fuel. Carb icing is another one. If you have carburetor icing, icing inside the carburetor is where the fuel and air get mixed before going into the cylinders. If you have carburetor icing, you could be blocking that entire path of fuel air to get into the cylinders. So you're essentially choking the engine of fuel and air. So engine's not getting fuel and air, engine's not going to run. So carburetor icing, less common. You can have bad magnetos. That's why we check the magnetos on pre-flight, is to make sure that you don't have bad magnetos. But very rarely you might have magneto failure. But that's why you have two. So this is a lot less likely of a situation. And then another reason would be contaminated / improper fuel. Contaminated fuel could lead to fuel starvation. Improper fuel, you accidentally put Jet A into your 150. Engine's not meant to run on Jet A. It's not meant to convert Jet A those chemicals into mechanical energy. It's rated for avgas. So if you have improper fuel, engine's not rated for that. Electrical failures, you could have over or under voltage. So the checking the ammeter, which just tells you the charge on the battery, should be part of your scan when you're in cruise. You check it on pre-flight, you check it during the run-up, of course, but it should also be all of like the engine gauges and the electrical gauges should be part of your cruise scan as well, not just obviously you guys are mostly looking outside because if you're private pilot, if you're instrument rated, you're just looking at the instruments. Either way, you need to include the engine gauges, like the oil gauges and the fuel gauges and the ammeter in your scan. Because the earlier you can detect a problem, the more time you have to fix it. So alternator failure, which would ultimately lead to a battery failure, you would get an indication of an alternator failure with either an over or under voltage, most likely an under voltage, but over voltages do happen. So if you have the ammeter, usually it'll be like, this is 0, and then this is the positive side, and this is the negative side. Usually the needle is like just past the 0 on the positive side. That's comfortable. If it starts falling over the negative side, you have a discharge. And what a discharge means is the battery's not getting charged. You are now pulling electricity from the battery. Normally it's on the positive side because the battery's getting charged by the alternator. It's just a bucket of water that's constantly getting refilled from the alternator. But you pull the alternator out of there, you're no longer filling up the bucket with water. Now you're taking water directly from the battery bucket. So there's a discharge there. That tells you your alternator is not working. Circuit breakers and fuses popping out, that's an indication of some sort of malfunction in the electrical system. Typically, I've never seen more than one pop out at once. So usually it might just be like, sometimes literally wires get crossed. The casing around the wires get worn, and the electricity, electricity is hot. So the casing is supposed to protect the wire. It happens where sometimes the wire is so close to like the backside of the panel that it like chafes. And over time, the casing might wear down and the heat from the wire inside could melt the rest of it and either cause like a circuit breaker or a fuse to pop or to cause electrical failure or electrical fire, worst case scenario. So just things that could happen. Hopefully things like that get caught during maintenance, but there's never any guarantee. Grounding issues. So similarly, these are like less common, but like you could have components that just are not grounding properly, and that could lead to over voltage, that could lead to electrical fires as well. Yeah, any questions on all of that? What like I have a habit of going off on tangents, so let me know if I'm talking nonsense. The Unfortunately, fuel mismanagement is very not very common, but like it's a common um, statistic for accident reports. It's something that does not have to happen, but you have to think about like maybe it's a lack of familiarity with that airplane and those fuel systems, lack of experience, you get distracted. It can be super easy to forget to set a timer. If you're on a low wing airplane, setting timers for both tanks, it's kind of easy to forget if you're not proficient in that plane. Um, or maybe you're super proficient in the plane and you get complacent and you forget to set the timer. All sorts of things can happen. You have your phone on you, someone calls you, and then and like we have Bluetooth headsets. So someone calls you, you're able to answer the phone now in the cockpit, which is like a good and a bad thing. Bad thing because it can distract you. And when non-standard things happen during your pre-flight, you got to think about your pre-flight and you have to think about your flows like a ritual. When your ritual is interrupted, it's a little bit hard to jump right back into where you left off. That's why we have checklists. So the checklists are specifically for if you get distracted, if you are not familiar with an airplane, or if something non-standard happens and kind of throws you off of your flow, you always have the checklist to back yourself up. Oh, pitot-static. So if you have any errors with the pitot-static system, airspeed, altimeter, VSI, we talked about pressure differential, static ports, pitot tube, calibrated leak. Just to talk about malfunctions, we kind of touched on one is when the airspeed indicator or when the pitot tube ram air inlet is blocked, airspeed drops to 0. Or otherwise it will, or no, never mind. Yeah, it'll drop to 0. Um, or if you have the entire pitot tube, let's say it's iced over, the entire pitot tube is iced over, that includes the ram air inlet and the drain hole, which is, remember, on the back of the pitot tube. Now what you're doing is you no longer have the ram air pressure, but you have trapped static pressure. So what happens is your airspeed indicator acts like an altimeter because your altimeter uses trapped static air pressure in order to determine like how high you are or if you're climbing or descending. Now your pitot tubes or your airspeed indicator is operating the same way. So what will happen is your airspeed will freeze or your airspeed will be fine if staying straight and level at whatever altitude and airspeed you were at when it got iced over. When you start climbing, the airspeed is going to increase. And when you start descending, the airspeed is going to decrease, which is typically opposite of what you're expecting. Normally, when you descend, you speed up. And when you climb, you slow down. Now it's acting opposite because now it's an altimeter. So um, pitot-static errors are very commonly asked questions on check rides. So definitely familiarize yourself with that. So again, if your pitot tube becomes blocked, there's no more ram air pressure. Any excess pressure leaks out of the drain hole, and you'll be comparing your airspeed indicator will just be at 0 if just the ram air inlet is blocked. If the whole thing is blocked, including the drain hole, now it's an altimeter. Vacuum system, any errors with that, typically it's like a lack of suction. And so your attitude indicator, typically it'll like flip upside down and it'll just be done. And your heading indicator will just start spinning rapidly. So it's pretty easy to tell if those instruments have failed because they're no longer right side up. And if your vacuum system fails, not an emergency. You can still see outside. You can navigate outside. If your vacuum system failed when in IFR conditions, if you're instrument rated and you're an IMC, that is an emergency because your attitude and your heading are your only reference to what direction you're going. Okay, talking more about the engine start. We kind of walked through the steps, but just to kind of reiterate, the normally aspirated, it's piston driven. Normally aspirated, you could have a carbureted engine or a fuel injected engine. And if we're talking fuel injection, it means you just don't have a carburetor. And when the fuel is still fed to the engine through gravity, but now it enters a fuel distribution unit, and there's a bunch of little tubes that go to each cylinder, and the fuel gets directly put into the cylinders, and it's metered more accurately than like a carburetor engine. So fuel injected engines are just more fuel efficient. So that's kind of the direction that most general aviation airplanes are going is fuel injection, but obviously there's still carbureted engines out there. So, and they both have their advantages and disadvantages. Like fuel injection, you don't have carb ice. But with fuel injected engines, they suck to start when they're hot because what'll happen is you have these little tubes, these little fuel lines. When you shut off the engine, it's hot, and any fuel that's still left over in those lines vaporizes. So now you have all these little air pockets in the fuel lines. When you try to start the engine when it's so hot in a fuel injected airplane, it's called vapor lock. Those little pockets of gas, engine doesn't run on gas, like not like vapor. It runs on liquid gas, like gasoline. So when you have this vapor, you're just like putting air into the cylinders. It's not going to run that way. Think about it like if you have liquid in a straw and like when you're at the bottom of the cup and you're sucking liquid through the straw, and then it kind of makes like that annoying suction sound because you're hitting all those air pockets. That's what's happening in your engine. So fuel injected engines suck to hot start, but they are more fuel efficient overall. And once you get comfortable hot starting, it's not that big of a deal. But I'm just giving you that wisdom so that you can manage your expectations. If you ever have to hot start a fuel injected airplane, they're not easy until you get used to it. And then I wanted to talk more about the four strokes of the pistons inside the engine. So remember, the pistons are connected to the crankshaft, which is this funky looking arm, and they move up and down inside the cylinder. So, and inside the cylinder, you have two little valves. You have an injection valve and an exhaust valve. So, injection valve injects fuel air mixture inside the cylinder. The piston, the first stroke is the intake. So the piston moves down and it sucks the fuel air mixture into the cylinder, and then it moves down and then it moves back up. The momentum makes it go back up. It compresses the fuel air mixture, so it moves back up and squeezes that fuel air mixture. And then you have spark plugs, which spark, and what they do is they provide the combustion. So the spark plugs ignite the fuel air mixture. There's an explosion called combustion, and then the piston, then the next stroke would be the exhaust. So any like after the power stroke, after the combustion, the piston moves back up and it pushes like the burned gas outside, which is the exhaust. So intake, compression, combustion, exhaust. You're going to hear this, and it's kind of inappropriate, but you're going to hear this. You have suck, squeeze, bang, blow if you need help memorizing it. So intake, compression, combustion, and then exhaust. So those are the four strokes of your normally aspirated piston aircraft. Spark plugs are what ignite the fuel air mixture. You're converting chemical energy into mechanical energy. And then the spark plugs, you've also got two of those per cylinder. And then if you're interested, I put turboprop information on here. When I send you guys the presentation, you'll get my notes too. So just if you're curious, I know it's already 6:53, so I don't want to go too deep into it. But I will send you the notes if you're curious and you want to read. We kind of already talked about the engine starting, but here's just it in writing. Master on, ignition start, starter spins, starter engages the flywheel, crankshaft rotates, pistons reciprocate, magneto spin, spark plugs fire, fuel air mixture ignite. And then you get the four-stroke process just over and over and over again. So the magnetos power the spark plugs, which cause the fuel air mixture to ignite. And magnetos also provide electricity for the engine. Here's a picture of carburetor, just for your visual reference. Remember I was talking about the mixture earlier, how it opens and closes the valve. When you pull out the mix, or when you push in the mixture, what you're doing is you're opening this little valve right here. And then when you pull out the mixture, when you lean it, you're actually closing this valve just a little bit. And so here's like fuel from the tank going into the discharge nozzle into the carburetor. This is where the air gets mixed from down here. Air comes from the intake, which is the induction system. The air intake is just right below the propeller on the nose. So you're getting air from there, from the air intake, flows into the carburetor, just where the fuel also flows into the two of the mix. The throttle opens and closes this valve. It's called a butterfly valve. So that's why sometimes you'll hear, instead of like throttle idle or throttle full, you'll hear close the throttle, open the throttle. You're opening and closing a valve. So if I say open the throttle, that means I'm jamming the throttle all the way up, all the way in. And this butterfly valve, it'll turn like that. And so then you're getting like maximum fuel air mixture going into the engines and more power. If I say close the throttle, and that means you pull the throttle out, that valve then kind of turns and closes a little bit. It closes this opening right here. So less fuel air mixture going in, less power. Here's just an image of the 172 engine without the cowling on. Here's that flywheel I was talking about. Here's that alternator belt we discussed. The crankshaft is inside this casing, so you can't really see that. But these are the cylinders. Cylinder was removed, and the pistons are inside. I think actually might be the piston that you can see. Here's where here's where your spark plug would plug in right here, and then you have another one on top. So you have two per engine, one on top, one on bottom. This black cylinder right here, those are your magnetos. This white cylinder back here, that's an oil filter. Those get replaced every oil change. Yeah, and then this is like the fuel strainer on the 172. I think this is an M model. So just for your reference. 4 cylinders. So it's a 4-cylinder engine. This is Lycoming engine. The other one's Continental. This goes down to the exhaust right here. So you want to make, if you can see them, when you peek in through like the oil window, making sure that there's no cracks along this pipe down here. Yeah, so anytime you can look at an aircraft engine without the cowling on, super useful information.
I have a quick question about this.
Yeah, yeah.
If you say that the propeller is like a direct drive propeller,
Mm-hmm.
does that just mean like it's directly connected to the crankshaft?
Let's go back into my brain for direct drive. Yes.
Or
So
when you
it
say like,
turns at the same speed as the crankshaft. Yes. So I think the way you said it was correct. Like
okay,
it's directly connected to the crankshaft. Because
so
I think in
okay,
like a turboprop, it's not. I think there's some gearbox in between the propeller and the crankshaft that it adjusts something to where like it adjusts the propeller speed to match like whatever power is available. I'd have to look at what I've written down about turboprops, but you're correct in saying like the propeller turns at the same speed and is like bolted to the crankshaft.
okay,
That's direct drive.
okay.
Yeah. So you were right. My brain just needed like time to process it. And I think even let me look because in my I just had little notes on turboprops. Yeah, that's a reduction gearbox. The spinning turbines are connected to a shaft which runs through the reduction gearbox. So the reduction gearbox slows down the high RPM of the turbine, to a speed that is suitable for propeller operation. So it helps appropriately pace the rotational energy that turns the propeller. So there's like with the turboprop, there's like a middleman now. But direct drive is like what you said, it's bolted to the crankshaft and it turns at the same speed as the crankshaft. So, but yeah, if you're curious about turboprops, I do have notes on those and I will send them to all of you if you would like, if you're curious. Obviously, you can Google it. Of course, you don't need my notes for anything, but um, it might just be helpful to, review someone else's notes sometimes. Kind of helps filter through all the information because there's a lot of it, obviously. We went like, I don't know if these are normally like an hour, but I went to an hour and a half, which I'm not surprised. So yeah, that's all I had for systems. I mean, maybe it was a lot, maybe it wasn't enough, but hopefully everyone learned something. And then, oh, let's see, there's a question. Can you change your own oil? Yes, you can absolutely change your own oil. You can change your own oil. You can change pretty much any fluids in the plane, like hydraulic fluids, brake fluids. I can see Jamie is on this and she's in the plane right now. So yeah, hydraulic fluid, oil, you can change that, de-icing fluid, brake fluid, if I didn't say that. Pretty much anything that you could do on your car, you could essentially do on an airplane. You have to make sure that you log it in the maintenance logs for the plane. So if you change the oil, that would be like an engine log thing. So you would just put the date, the tachometer time on the engine, and the scope of work. You change the oil filter, put the part number of the oil filter, what type of oil you put into the plane. Yeah, any like things that got replaced or cleaned, and then you would put your name, your full name, your signature, and your certificate number. So you have to make sure you log it, but you can absolutely change your own oil. You could also change your own tires. Um, you can clean your spark plugs. There's a whole lot of things that they allow us to do. Change light bulbs. You're allowed to do all of that. So I have Colleen's email and Pam's email. Anyone else wants me to email them my presentation, happy to do so. It just makes things easier. And I'll include my notes on there. So you guys can refer to those later. But are there any questions on anything else?
Can I actually ask a question?
Sure.
I don't know if you can do this quickly or not. I'm not trying to keep you forever.
Okay.
But could you touch on denotation and pre-ignition?
Oh yeah, so detonation and pre-ignition.
Yes.
Yeah, I feel like I have a diagram. Detonation and pre-ignition, it's funny, they actually have like the same symptoms. So ultimately what you have is like it's abnormal combustion at improper timing. So when mechanics go through like the 100-hour for an airplane, they'll do something called timing the magnetos. And ultimately what they're making sure is that the spark plugs are all firing at the same time. The magnetos are uh, powering the spark plugs at the same time. So everything is being ignited at the same time. If you have improper timing, you could have, or if you just have like improper timing of the magnetos, or if you put in the incorrect fuel, you could have detonation or pre-ignition. So detonation is just an uncontrolled explosive burning of like the fuel air mixture. And usually that would be caused by like improper fuel inside the engine or like excessive temperature inside the engine. So if we talk about excessive temperature in the engine, oil is what cools down the engine. Oil cools, cleans, and lubricates engines. Maybe if you don't have enough oil in the plane, the engine's now operating at an excessive temperature, that could lead to detonation. Pre-ignition is when you have ignition of the fuel air mixture before the spark plugs even fire. So, and that could be caused, let me look at I have a chart. I'm just looking. Let's see. Yeah, so pre-ignition, it combusts before it's supposed to. Detonation is it's explosive. But honestly, they both kind of feel and sound the same. So like you
Like,
might, oh, go
could
ahead.
pre-ignition be like a carbon deposit on like, is that pre-ignition if there was like
No,
something
yeah,
lingering maybe on the inside?
right. Like, because sometimes that happens. Like, you get lead buildup on the spark plugs.
Or would that be more like detonation?
I want to say that would be more like detonation,
Okay. Oh,
because that could cause like I can imagine if you have like too much buildup and then the spark plug is eventually able to blow it off, but it might be explosive because of all that material. So I would say, yeah, I'd say more detonation on that one. But either way, so they're both abnormal forms of combustion of the fuel air mixture. Detonation is explosive and caused by like excessive temperature or improper fuel. And then pre-ignition is when it combusts before the spark plug even fires, so the timing is off. Um, they can absolutely like destroy your pistons and your engines. So if there's something abnormally hot inside the cylinder, it could ignite the fuel air mixture before the spark plug. So that could just be like if there's like corrosion inside the piston that leads to hot spots and that ignites the fuel air mixture instead of the spark plug, that could lead to pre-ignition. So like these random little hot spots inside of the cylinder, that could cause pre-ignition. Does that help?
Yeah, that was really helpful. Thank you.
Okay, I was gonna say you can totally say if that did not help because
Thank
that's a great question, and that's actually a good topic to talk about. Cool. Well, any other questions? Hopefully this helped, and hopefully the notes help you too. And if anyone is interested, we do have that private pilot in-person ground school starting up next month, June 7th. We do have Zoom spots available if you're not from like the California, or if you're not from the Sacramento area. So feel free to message me about that. You can message me at Meghan, Meghan, at girlsofthefly.com. You could also contact anyone really from Girls of the Fly, like info at Girls of the Fly if you're interested in that ground school at all. We do go over systems again, but like it's like a 3.5 hour lesson versus like an hour and a half. So if you want to hear me talk some more and like just go off on many, many tangents, feel free to let me know if you're interested, because I honestly could probably do 5 hour lessons, but nobody wants to sit there that long. And I don't blame you. So they're fun though. I have fun. I have a great time. I hope everybody else has a great time. No one has said otherwise. So yeah, if you're interested, let me know. Happy to have you guys there. But
This was awesome. Thank you
thank
so
you. I'm
much. I
so
loved
glad.
it. It was
Thank
really,
you.
really helpful.
I'm always nervous to talk about systems, but I make myself do it because it's like it's not my strongest area. But
Oh, my word, me either, but you could never tell. You're
thank
like a
you.
pro, so
Oh,
thank you
thanks so
so
much. That
much.
means a lot. I'll take everyone's email and I will send you guys all of my stuff and all of my notes.
The visual
You'll
aids were
have that.
great.
What's that?
The visual aids were great.
Oh, thank you. I'm glad. Yeah, it's funny. I'm actually not a super visual person, but I feel like it helps put things together, especially with systems. And like, if I try to explain the casing of like an instrument, there's no easy way of doing that. So I'm glad the visuals were good. Yeah, and I'll also take a picture of the board and let you guys have that too. Cool. All right, y'all. Well, have a great rest of your evening, and thanks for joining us. And I'll probably see you again at some other point. Probably do another one. So cool. Have a good day, you guys, or a good night. I don't know where you live, so good night, good morning, good evening.
Bye from
Okay,
Boston.
bye. Bye. Okay, bye. Good night. Actually, I'm gonna copy all these emails. But I can pause the recording. Up in here. Pauline. Find her Instagram. Good. I'm still recording. Okay, bye.